Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name's Indy Buller. I work in the LSE library as one of the curators, and one of my tasks, one of my regular roles is to put on exhibitions, which leads me on very briefly to a bit of shameless promotion for the current library exhibition. You've all got a flyer, I think, in front of you called A Time for Revolutions, The Making of the Welfare State, and that's why we sort of organised tonight's talk with Professor Stewart here. The exhibition tells the story of the welfare state, from poor laws to universal credit. And the talk tonight, which Professor Stewart's going to give very soon, relates very strongly to that. Before I introduce Professor Stewart, just some housekeeping. If there is a fire alarm, or you do hear a fire alarm go off, there are two exits. The first is obviously the one which you came through. There's also another exit over there. At the end of the talk, we will have time for questions. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, just put your hands up and one of the stewards will come around with a microphone. And the event is being recorded, so speak into the microphone, that would be great. So that leads me on very neatly to introducing Professor John Stewart, who is Emeritus Professor of Health History at Glasgow Caledonian University. He's also been working very closely with us at the school at LSE on a biography, which has been sponsored by the school, all about the man that we're going to hear a little bit more about in tonight's talk, Richard Titmuss. So, without further ado, I will let John speak to that.
Thank you, Indy. Well, thank you very much and good evening. As Indy mentioned, my current project is a biography of Richard Titmuss, sponsored by the Brian Abel Smith Foundation Fund here at the LSE, and part of a mini-series, LSE Pioneers in Social Policy. The first volume has appeared in 2014, Sally Sheard's volume on Brian Abel Smith. And there's the man himself, for those of you who haven't seen him, Richard Titmuss, and that's Sally's volume, which, as I say, came out in 2014. My own work is going to be published by Policy Press in 2020. As I presumably don't have to tell most of the people in this audience, Richard Titmuss was appointed as the first professor in social administration at the London School of Economics in 1950, and between then and his death in 1973, he helped create, at first almost single-handedly, the academic field which we now call social policy. Among his many preoccupations was healthcare, an interest which predated his LSE appointment, although for the most part, what I'd like to do this evening is focus on his support for the NHS, for the National Health Service, while drawing attention to his important criticisms of the service and, in particular, his critique of the medical profession. What I have to say derives both from Titmuss's own published work and from the extensive Titmuss archive held across the way in the British Library of Political and Economic Science. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the archive staff for their assistance over the last 3 years and hopefully into the next 18 months or so. So to start with, as far as Titmuss was concerned, the highly positive aspects of the NHS, we might take an article from the mid-1960s, published in the medical journal The Lancet. Here he claimed that the creation of the NHS in the late 1940s was, quote, one of the most unsordid and civilised actions in the history of health and welfare policy. The content and broader context of this article was significant in that, first, it sought to promote the so-called family doctor, in other words, general practitioners or GPs, and second, that it was published around the time Titmuss took up membership of the Royal Commission on Medical Education. Both of these are topics to which we shall return, but it's worth flagging up now that part of the appeal of the GP for Titmuss was that such doctors were, as the name would suggest, generalists. For one problem he saw in the provision of social services was over-specialisation, whether among doctors or other welfare professionals, and he called this technocracy, and again we'll come back to this word technocracy later. In the meantime, though, how did this unsordid and civilised action, the NHS, actually manifest itself? Titmuss died from lung cancer, which, rather ironically in a way, had initially been misdiagnosed. Consequently, towards the end of his life, he had a lot of personal contact with the NHS and its hospital care and treatment. Being Titmuss, he recorded his patient experiences to use in his lectures to LSE students, and indeed this material was posthumously published as Social Policy, an Introduction. At least part of it was published in that. And here's how that volume concludes. This is the long quote at the top of the slide. Among all the other experiences I had, he means in the NHS, another which stands out is that of a young West Indian from Trinidad, aged 25, with cancer of the rectum. His appointment was the same time as mine for radium treatment, 10 o'clock every day. Sometimes he went into the Theratron room first, sometimes I did. What determined waiting was quite simply the vagaries of London traffic, not race, religion, colour or class. So here we begin to see some of the features of the NHS which so attracted Titmuss. Patients were treated simply and straightforwardly as citizens, irrespective of, for example, their social standing, which we might read as a proxy for income since, as all his students and readers would have known, NHS treatment was without cost at the point of consumption. The point about race and colour is also notable, I think. Titmuss was an active supporter of those whom in his time would have been described as Commonwealth immigrants. Added to that, he believed that social policy should have a moral purpose, that being, among other things, to promote social cohesion and social solidarity, and so to reduce inequalities. The latter included racial inequalities, and one of the lessons which Titmuss drew from his extensive experience of social welfare in the United States was that even well-intentioned measures could have the unintended consequence of promoting racial discrimination. The NHS then, and by contrast, could act as an agent of integration, as witnessed by the experience of Titmuss's fellow cancer sufferer. The broader context here, of course, is the sort of racial tension being fuelled by interventions around this time, such as that of Enoch Powell, the Conservative politician and long-time intellectual sparring partner of Titmuss, and his 1968 Rivers of Blood speech, and we'll come back to Powell in another context later on. So far, so good then. Better still, as far as Titmuss was concerned, the NHS could also enable altruism. For Titmuss, individuals and societies, at their best, acted without regard to self and to the benefit of unknown others. In itself, the NHS could be viewed as an example of altruism in action. It was funded out of general taxation and was, in the famous formula, universal, comprehensive and free. That is, it was society which bore the cost, and the service was available to all citizens, covered all aspects of medical care, and to repeat the point, was free at the point of consumption. It's not actually free, of course, but it was free at the point of consumption. And nestling within the structures of the NHS was a very particular example of altruism in action, the blood transfusion service. Backed up by the structures and personnel of socialised medicine, people gave their blood freely, without material reward, and without knowing whom their blood would end up helping. This was, for Titmuss, altruism in its purest form. In his last, and perhaps most famous book, The Gift Relationship, Titmuss contrasted the situation in Britain with that in the United States, where, by his account, the market played a key role through, for instance, commercial blood banks. Titmuss claimed that the British system was both morally superior to and more economically efficient than that of America. He therefore, in this volume, The Gift Relationship, repeated his assertion about the unsordid nature of the NHS, and that volume also provides the phrase which constitutes the first part of the title of this talk, a greater good, which I can't say obviously, a greater good transcending. And it's worth briefly expanding on this, as it does give a further sense of how Titmuss viewed the NHS and the potential for morally based social policy. voluntary blood donors in a system structured by the health service were taking part, he suggested, in the creation, in quote, the creation of a greater good transcending the good of self-love. In order to love themselves, donors recognised the need to love strangers. By contrast, one of the functions of what he called the atomised private market systems was to release individuals from any sense of obligation to others. For a number of reasons, this was, he thought, fundamentally antisocial and corrosive of shared values. Indeed, it was an assault on freedom, both individual and clinical. Again, it's worth stressing the broader context here. Titmuss's long-standing, often acrimonious and sometimes litigious dispute with the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. The IEA was pressing for market principles to be introduced into healthcare while contesting Titmuss's arguments about the relative efficiency of the British and American blood transfusion systems. In passing, I think it's worth noting that Titmuss's arguments about bloods have been positively revisited in the last few years by, for example, the apparently ubiquitous Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, and rather the other end of the spectrum, as it were, by members of the Scottish Parliament. I was surprised when I Googled this to find the Scottish Parliament come out having a quite profound discussion about Richard Titmuss a few years back, but there you go. As we'll see in a few moments, Titmuss did have some fairly substantial criticisms of British healthcare provision. Nonetheless, as we've seen, he was keen to sing the praises of the NHS and its system of blood collection, and nowhere more so than in the United States. With the coming of a Democrat administration in 1960, hopes were raised for the reform of American health insurance. Titmuss was frequently called upon both to advise federal officials and to correct what was perceived as the false propaganda against socialised medicine put out by, especially, the American Medical Association, backed up, Titmuss claimed, by the IEA. It's significant, perhaps, that the gift relationship was especially well received in the United States and credited with influencing federal policy on blood banks. And another, perhaps less obvious aspect of Titmuss's support for the NHS was it came closest to fulfilling the promise of social reconstruction generated by the Second World War, the embodiment, as Titmuss saw it, of the spirit of Dunkirk and of the Blitz, initially explored in another of his major works, Problems of Social Policy, which was published in 1950. Other social services set up after 1945 were, for him, much less satisfactory. This was one explanation as to why Titmuss always put the phrase welfare state in inverted commas. Post-war welfare provision had not been especially satisfactory in the first place, was stigmatised as services for the poor, and was failing to keep pace with a rapidly changing society. As he was fond of arguing, while William Beveridge had provided a roadmap for the 1930s, by the 1950s, this map was completely out of date. As suggested, Titmuss did not see the NHS as some sort of flawless or timeless institution or system. In their famous report for the Guillebaud Committee, published in 1956, he and Brian Abel-Smith argued that the NHS was undoubtedly good value for money, but was also in need of substantially more financial support because of, for example, greater life expectancy and the impact of the revolution in drug therapies. This was an important moment in NHS history and a sharp lesson for both the Treasury and the Conservative government, which had commissioned the inquiry. But I would now like to suggest three further areas of concern, leading into a more detailed analysis of his views on the medical profession and their implications for the health service. Titmuss's early work in the 1930s and 40s had been concerned with population and population health. He had shown, for example, that health outcomes, such as infant mortality, varied markedly by region and especially by social class. There were, in other words, social determinants to health, and he expanded on these arguments through his work on social medicine in the 1940s, which again argued that an individual's health status was shaped by the socio-economic circumstances in which they found themselves. So here was the first point, that health had sociological as well as biological dimensions. Titmuss was concerned too with mental health, arguing, for example, that the stresses of modernity and changes in family life put pressure on emotional and mental well-being. Titmuss was famously critical of the so-called affluent society emerging in Britain in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, which he saw as both morally corrupt and as having the potential to psychologically damage individuals and thereby society. More immediately, Titmuss was a participant in the debate over the future of mental hospitals. In 1961, Enoch Powell, the politician whom we encountered earlier, and at this point Minister of Health, addressed the annual conference of the National Association for Mental Health. This was Powell's famous Water Towers speech, where he announced the shutting down of the large-scale Victorian asylums, which were home to many mentally ill patients, and a substantial shift to community care. Titmuss also addressed this meeting. Among his initially rather surprising proposals was that there should be a royal commission on medical education, although, as I'll suggest in a moment, this was a perfectly logical demand given the nature of his broader analysis. And while applauding any shift towards community care, Titmuss pointed out that there were not enough resources to support this. He claimed that expenditure had actually fallen over the previous decade. So, for instance, the number and quality of especially social workers was inadequate. So the second of Titmuss's concerns was the need for a much greater understanding of the psychological factors in ill health and the inclusion of such issues in the medical education syllabus. So I said there was 3 areas of concern that he had. What was the third? A few weeks before he was offered the LSE post, Titmuss gave a talk on BBC Radio entitled Crossroads in Social Policy. In essence, this argued that, in an era of rapid social change, society had to make choices about where it was heading in the provision of social services. In the last decade, since the crisis of Dunkirk, as he put it, there had been an immense broadening in the area of social responsibilities, specifically in health, education, housing, food, and income maintenance. Focusing on medical science, he suggested that, quote, the undoubted authority and prestige which it commands today, and this incidentally is a danger to medicine as well as to society, is one reason why it will not be easy to settle in a rational way the problem of social priorities in the welfare state. The growing power and influence of the professional and technical classes, meanwhile, was a problem for many of the social services. And while across the board there were real, as he put it, real dangers in this growth of diploma worship and professional syndicalism, these dangers were, he carried on, perhaps more serious in medicine than in other spheres. Such developments were tending to obscure the purposes for which the new social services had been created. In other words, the professional status and aspirations of doctors and other welfare professionals was winning out over the needs of patients and their families. But it wasn't simply a matter of professional status and power. Tied up with this was the increasing specialisation within the medical profession, engendered in part by post-war phenomena such as the huge advances in drug therapy and surgical techniques, which also, of course, had profound cost implications. There was a danger, therefore, that individual doctors would become more and more remote from the patients whom they were supposed to serve, and that the profession would form what Titmuss would later call, and a term which we've already encountered, a technocracy. So this was the third of Titmuss's concerns, and of course the contrast in this particular instance is with the general practitioner, or the family doctor. I don't think GPs are called family doctors anymore, but that had a particular meaning back when Titmuss was writing. So how did he begin to bring these sociological, psychological and professional technocratic concerns into the field of actual policy making, or at least policy deliberation? I'm going to give an example from the late 1950s, before looking at Titmuss's role in the Royal Commission on Medical Education. In summer 1959, that is just before the general election, which Labour went down to yet another defeat, the party published the pamphlet Members One of Another, which is, so I found out, a phrase from the New Testament. Ironically, given that Titmuss was an atheist. This argued, for instance, that in hospitals, nurses and other health workers were, quote, just as important as doctors, and that, significantly for present purposes, doctors needed better training in, quote, the social aspects of disease and in psychiatry, industrial medicine, modern prescribing, and the special skills needed in general practice. Teaching at London University, where the bulk of medical education took place, the pamphlet continued, quote, was dominated by Harley Street consultant practice and was thus isolated from the realities of medical work as most doctors have to practice it. Our Royal Commission on Medical Education was thus called for. What's interesting about this pamphlet, I think, is it was produced by a very high-powered working group in the Labour Party, whose members included not only Titmuss, but also leading Labour figures such as Aneurin Bevan and Richard Crossman. Bevan had, of course, been the minister responsible for setting up the National Health Service. Nonetheless, Titmuss had authored a position paper for the working group whose ideas and language were more or less reproduced verbatim in the pamphlet itself. So you could go to the archives across the road and look at Titmuss's position paper and compare it with the pamphlet, and they're more or less identical. Which also shows, of course, his status within the Labour Party and more broadly at this time. This forms a precursor to the sort of issues Titmuss was to bring into a more enhanced policy-making context in a few years' time. With the return of the Labour Party to government in 1964, Titmuss got one of his wishes in the form of a Royal Commission on Medical Education, the Todd Commission as it was called, and of which he was a member. The Commission reported in 1968, noting that it had been asked to review medical education, quote, in the light of national needs and resources, and its main proposals were as follows. First, a fundamental underlying principle was that all doctors, including GPs, would be, as the report put it, specialists in particular aspects of medicine and of equal status. Second, undergraduate education should be firmly based in universities. The aim of undergraduate degrees, which should take 5 years, was, quote, to produce not a finished doctor, but a broadly educated man, I'm afraid it does say man, who can become a doctor by further training. Third, the Commission recommended that the annual intake of medical schools be doubled by 1990 to address present and future personnel shortfalls. Fourth, a reduction by way of merger in the number of medical schools in London was proposed. Finally, the Commission had been asked to consider medical education in Britain in the wider context of assistance to developing countries. It was thus proposing further linkages between British medical schools and those in the developing countries. By definition, the final report of a Royal Commission is the work of many hands, not only its members, but also its civil servants. Nonetheless, we can clearly discern some particular areas which bear Titmuss's imprint. Indeed, this was something which was noted at the time. Reviewing the report in the recently founded journal Social Policy and Administration, the psychiatrist Hugh Freeman suspected the guiding hand of Professor Titmuss in a passage which is likely to become a classic. Taken from the section of the report entitled Future Medical and Social Needs, the lines which had particularly caught Freeman's attention suggested that, and again this is the middle quote here, attitudes towards doctors as towards members of other professions are likely to move further still in the direction of regarding them as experts to be called in to prevent, investigate and remedy specific functional defects, rather than as members of an elite who are accorded a special status by virtue of their general background in education. And my emphasis in that quote. Freeman did not make it clear why he had signalled out this particular passage as especially redolent of Titmuss, but it's a shrewd observation nonetheless, given Titmuss's concerns about the power of elite groups in society in general. So, for instance, as part of his researches for the Royal Commission, Titmuss enrolled the help of Brian Abel Smith in the latter's capacity as a governor of St Thomas's Hospital. Titmuss wanted to know about admissions policies, and Abel Smith reported that, for example, a recent survey at St Thomas's had suggested that 1/3 of students were the sons, again it's sons, of doctors, and half of this number had parents educated at St Thomas's. Rather ominously, Abel Smith told Titmuss that he had gained the impression, quote, that I would not be encouraged to ask any further questions. But it's easy enough to see what's going on here. The production of a privileged group, often drawing recruits from its own ranks. As Titmuss had observed in the 1950 radio broadcast we noted earlier, it was apparent even at that early point that the NHS, quote, had been of great benefit to the middle classes and various professional interests. It had, again to continue the quote, many more opportunities of employment in reasonably well-paid jobs, permanent and pensionable, for the sons and daughters of middle-class parents. More broadly, much of the Todd Commission's work was done by small committees, and it's clear from the records that Titmuss was especially involved with that on undergraduate education, and that his ideas fed, once again, sometimes verbatim, into the final report. Sorry. So, for instance, he was sent a memorandum drawn up by officials entitled The Behavioural Sciences Undergraduate Education. And on this official document, again, which is available across the road, Titmuss made a number of handwritten comments. So, for instance, after the printed sentence, produced by the civil service in other words, the impact of scientific, technological and social factors on the role of the doctor and the social functions of medicine, Titmuss inserted the evolution of medical services in response to social problems and the changing nature of disease. Similarly, after the original The Causes and Relief of Poverty, Deprivation and Handicap comes, in Titmuss's notoriously untidy scrawl, Levels of Living in Childhood, Working Age and Old Age. So one part of the report, which was undoubtedly Titmuss's work, was an appendix that produced specimen syllabus in social factors related to medicine. This was to be a component of the behavioural sciences dimension of the medical undergraduate syllabus. It directly incorporated some of the handwritten amendments already noted and was a distillation of a number of Titmuss's particular concerns. The course's principal themes were to be sociological concepts, demographic trends, the family, social stratification, social pathology, social medicine in the community, the health services, and the study of social administration. The Appendix's introduction, again authored by Titmuss, set the tone, proposing that the course start off with the social history of medicine and medical care. This would not be an antiquarian's course. It would begin with the 20th century and illuminate historical cause and effect. The impact of scientific, technological and social factors on the role of the doctor in the social functions of medicine. The evolution of medical services in response to social pressures and the changing nature of disease. Patterns of medical care organisation, the scope of medical specialities and changing concepts of health and disease. The ethics of medicine seen professionally and in the context of social change. Not a course to necessarily look forward to, I wouldn't have thought, if one was an undergraduate. So overall, what we can see here is Titmuss's critique of existing medical education and, by extension, of the current ignorance of doctors when it came to sociological and psychological factors in ill health. I'd just like to say something, too, about the last point in the long paragraph just quoted, that about medical ethics. For Titmuss, the role of the doctor was to cure sickness and, where possible, to prevent ill health. Doctors should be allowed to operate with clinical freedom, but without losing sight of the moral fact. Titmuss was very keen on phrases like the moral fact, that patients came first. Anything which interfered with clinical freedom or with prioritising patients, and especially the introduction of any monetary transactions, was therefore ethically unsound. This helps explain an intervention Titmuss made in 1965, just as he was starting his work for the Todd Commission. The British Medical Association, the BMA, had at its recent conference passed a resolution demanding the introduction of direct payments by patients to doctors, which might then be recoverable from the state. Titmuss was interviewed about this in a radio programme and asked what he thought. Not for the first time, he suggested the BMA had devoted much of its conference to discussing doctors' pay claims. The resolution itself, he continued, was a really black day in the history of medical ethics in this country. And just in passing, it's perhaps worth noting that within a couple of years, his old sparring partner, Enoch Powell, was reflecting on his time as Minister of Health and famously said that when one became Minister of Health, one had to realise two things immediately. First of all, that there was an infinite demand for medical care, and secondly, all that doctors ever wanted to talk about was money. So rather improbably, we find Titmuss and, for once I think, Titmuss and Enoch Powell on the same page, as they say. One further aspect of the report's proposals is worth comment. The Todd Commission had noted the need to increase the supply of medical students and to consider medical education in the context of British aid to developing countries. How were these two things related? The issue of medical personnel had been addressed in an ultimately unsatisfactory way by the Willink Committee, sitting between 1954 and 1967. So in other words, people had been thinking about how many doctors we might need, but this committee was famously or infamously bad at coming to any kind of conclusion about the matter. By the 1960s, meanwhile, the NHS was becoming increasingly reliant on staff from overseas. In 1958, for instance, it was estimated that around 2,500 overseas doctors were working in hospitals in England and Wales, out of a total of some 16,000. Ironically, in the light of his later political career, Enoch Powell, when Minister of Health, had encouraged the recruitment of doctors from the Indian subcontinent. Titmuss addressed this issue and its implications in an article published while the Royal Commission was sitting. He noted that rich countries, such as Britain and the United States, were effectively importing skilled labour such as doctors. It was, he continued, and again to quote him, the height of national immorality to behave in this way. Qualified staff were being deliberately enticed from poorer countries to those which could easily afford to train their own staff, Britain and America, he means. In this process, these poor countries not only lost skilled labour, they were also forced to pay inflated rewards to those who remained. This was, he wrote, foreign aid in reverse. International measures were thus needed to protect poorer countries from being denuded of scientific manpower, while the rich countries should spend more on education to satisfy their own needs and, in a world more conscious of quality, to satisfy the needs of others. So foreign aid could not be better spent, he put it, than when it is helping a nation to achieve its own welfare. To put it another way, for Titmuss, the moral project that was the NHS should not be compromised by immoral behaviour in the recruitment of its staff. And to further the cause of altruism, this time at an international level, foreign aid should be used to encourage further health and welfare provision in developing countries and the educational facilities to back these up. But what about the Royal Commission? I've said quite a lot about that now. What actually became of it all? As Charles Webster, official historian of the NHS, points out, the Todd Commission's recommendations were only slowly implemented, and then, as he puts it, only in the most diluted form, partly as a result of somewhat predictable Treasury hostility. In private, Titmuss himself was sceptical about the chances of the Commission's recommendations being fully implemented. He was a member of an organisation called the Keppel Club, which is named after the street where the London School of Hygiene is located, and where Titmuss's close friend Jerry Morris worked. So at a Keppel Club meeting, Titmuss reported on his work for the Royal Commission. He suggested, for instance, that among its findings, the most controversial had been those concerning medical education in London. Here, as he put it, custom and history confronted the logistics of science and technology. It was frightening to contemplate the issues involved. For Titmuss, though, two matters required particular comment. The first was the Commission's decision to regard the family physician as being vital in the future pattern of medical care. As we have seen, this was a view to which Titmuss strongly subscribed, and again he had input into the final report on this. And in fact, in the wake of the Todd Commission, the status of GPs did begin to rise. The second point concerned the teaching of the behavioural sciences, where it had been assumed, as he pointed out, that these could be taught in medical schools without the creation of such faculties within the medical schools. There was, though, considerable doubt as to whether behavioural sciences wanted to, or were equipped to, accept such a role. So while Titmuss was a consistent advocate of, to put it as most diluted, a broader social education for medical students, in private he recognised that actually enabling this was highly problematic. Of course, the question was far from resolved then and continues to be an issue in medical education right now. Of course, there's nothing especially new in a Royal Commission's recommendations being only partially realised in policy, the point that Webster was kind of making. And the Todd Commission also has to be put in the context of a whole raft of proposals for reshaping social services in the 1960s and into the 1970s. But examining Titmuss's contribution to the Todd Commission allows us, along with the rest of the material we've looked at, to drop a sort of balance sheet of how he saw the NHS and those who worked in it. That's him with Brian Abel Smith, for those of you who don't recognise the chap on the right. On the plus side, for Titmuss, the NHS had immense potential, which to some extent was already being realised, for enabling social integration, reducing inequalities, and encouraging altruism. It was different from the other post-war social services in its funding and delivery, its lack of financial demands at the point of consumption, and its universality. I was just reading a speech Titmuss gave in Israel this afternoon, round about this very time, where he points out that the blood transfusion service in Britain could not conceivably have existed without a universal system such as the NHS backing it up. The service could thus promote the sort of moral agenda which Titmuss favoured, and this applied not only within Britain itself. In the United States, for instance, the NHS could be used to show up the anomalies and shortcomings, moral and economic, of market-based health care. An ethical health policy would, moreover, not exploit the human capital of developing countries. Rather, it would seek to promote health and welfare within those countries, both in terms of encouraging provision and the means whereby doctors and other health professionals might serve their own countries without the economic pressure to move to richer nations such as Britain. And ultimately, he felt this would help reduce inequalities between nations. Of course, there were also minuses in his analysis of the NHS. The funding of the service was an ongoing issue in a situation where, for instance, an ageing population and undoubted and welcome advances in medical care put pressure on existing services. This was a dynamic rather than static situation which changed all the time, as, for instance, new pharmaceutical discoveries were made. Nor were, for example, the psychological stresses of modernity about to disappear. Although it's not something I've had time to go into this evening, Titmuss had a lot of interesting things to say about the impact of automation in the workplace on, in particular, the skilled male worker. As some of you might know, a few years later, people like Harry Braverman are going to talk about the degradation of American labour. But in fact, Titmuss had, as I say, some very interesting things about the psychological impact of automation as it took place in the 1960s. Automation might lead, he suggested, to loss of status both in the workplace and in the family, with negative impacts on the individual's mental health. But perhaps the biggest challenge, as Titmuss saw it, was the medical profession itself. Like other welfare professionals, the medical profession could, circumstances permitting, prioritise its own interests over that of its patients, a process potentially exacerbated by the increasing rate of medical specialisation in the post-war era, the threat of technocracy. And of course, to add to this, there was a tendency of the profession to socially replicate itself. Hence, of course, some of the ideas which Titmuss promoted on the Royal Commission on Medical Education. In short, then, in Titmuss's analysis of the NHS, we end up with rather a mixed bag, which I guess is what we might expect. But at the very least, I think we can commend his insight into issues which certainly weren't anticipated when the service was set up in the late 1940s, and which nonetheless remain with us in whole or part today. And I'll leave it there, if you don't mind, before my voice completely gives out.
Great, thank you very much, John. Really fascinating talk. I've got a few questions for you before I ask them. I wondered if anyone else wanted to.
Hi there, it's Neil here. You've talked a bit about Titmuss and his battles with the BMA and with Enoch Powell. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how Titmuss perhaps fitted in with other critics, or perhaps friendly critics of the NHS in the 1950s, 60s and 70s? Presumably he wasn't a lone voice when he was being critical in various ways of the NHS, while also broadly supporting its aims.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the things, as usual, I'm going to slightly evade your question, but one of the things he felt about the welfare state in broad terms was that people had just kind of thought that everything had been resolved in 1948 when you had the National Insurance Act and the National Assistance Act and the NHS came into being. And that people hadn't really critically thought about where welfare was taking them. And I think that a lot of that, I mean, the section of society with which he'd most to do is the Labour movement, of course. And within, if you look at Labour Party documents about the National Health Service, it's kind of, hooray, we created the National Health Service, that's fine, nothing more to say, let's move on kind of stuff. But as I've tried to explain, he had this much more critical attitude towards the NHS. Having said that, as the pamphlet members one of another might suggest, there was a kind of element of class hostility, let's say, within the Labour Party towards groups like doctors who were seen as posh professionals who, certainly in London University, who hung out in Harley Street and didn't know the first thing about, medicine in the East End of London or something like that. So there were elements within the left, let's say the liberal left, which was worried about, in particular, I think, the medical profession. But you don't... I think for a lot of his life, Titmuss thought he was swimming against the tide, that he had to kind of really explain this sort of stuff to people about, the shortcomings of the National Health Service. I should say also that his critique of doctors carries some weight, I think, and clearly some people bought into it. When you move into other welfare professionals, they tend to get more of a free pass, actually, social workers and so on, because people don't like to be nasty about social workers, I suppose, unjustifiably. But the whole issue of welfare professionals was one which he started banging on about in 1950 and was still banging on about in 1973, which would suggest that not everybody was taking his arguments on board at that point. I mean, I think we can accept a lot of that now. The idea that professions replicate themselves, or a lot of the work done in this very institution about how welfare professionals are not necessarily altruists would seem to suggest that this is something that has been taken on board over the last 30 or 40 years. Bob Pinker is one of the early exponents of this sort of idea. But a lot of the NHS in particular got this kind of free pass, for a long period. It's only once things start going really bad, the economic crisis in the 70s, and the rise of neoliberalism and all that sort of stuff, that you get serious challenges. But no, I think he thought he was swimming against the tide to some extent. Anyway, that doesn't really answer your question. But there you
go. I think that from my limited knowledge of Richard, I think he came to academia not a very traditional route. I think he left school quite young, had some time in industry. How do you think that affected or impacted on his ideas around sort of socialised care?
Yes, discuss. I change my mind about this every day. I mean, his ideas are very, very complex, I think, and on at least one level, a throwback to pre-First World War liberalism, progressive liberalism. I think he may well have been sceptical about professionals on what we would see as quite legitimate grounds. Whether this was overlain with a kind of chippiness or a chip in the shoulder is something I've yet to, fully unpick, as it were. What's interesting in that context, though, is he's very critical, as well he might have been, about a lot of the teaching that took place at the London School of Economics back in the 60s, when students weren't filling in course evaluation forms or anything like that, and where staff would absent themselves, according to the reports I've seen, willy-nilly. So he was very critical of that. He thought this was incredibly unprofessional. But he also went to considerable pains, it seems to me, to defend frontline staff in the welfare state. So at one point he says the young people who haven't been to university but work in what are then called supplementary benefit commission offices, job centres or whatever nowadays, they know more about the world than the students at the LSE, because the students at the LSE are all middle class and kind of, they wouldn't know a manual worker if they fell over one, kind of thing. So there is that element of kind of chippiness is a horrible expression, but you know what I mean. It's kind of, I'm against privilege. I mean, whether how sincere that was, it seems to me is another matter. But so far, I mean, along the same lines, he gives a talk at South Bank Polytechnic, as it then was, where he says, I'd much rather be speaking to people at South Bank Polytechnic than at Cambridge or Oxford or Essex was the other example he used. Well, it didn't really stop him talking at Oxford, Cambridge and Essex, so he wasn't that bothered about it. But I think he would sometimes play that kind of card sometimes, yeah. Sorry, again, that's evading the question.
I mean, in terms of his sort of relationships with his sort of co-academics or fellow workers, did he find much resistance to his ideas, or were people generally supportive of what he was saying?
What, in the school?
In the school, yeah.
Oh, no. He complained about this continually, how... There's a famous quote about fairly early on in his career where another professor came up to him and said, I'd how your gorgeous midwives. This was he didn't train midwives, but this was the social work students who were all female, of course. Oh no, there was a lot of aggravation with certain. I think it's, be careful what I say here, but especially the Department of Sociology, there was lots of bad blood, I think, between social administration and sociology. I was told, I've interviewed quite a few people for this project, and one of the people I interviewed was a student of Titmuss's and then worked here for a while. And she said that one of the most hostile people towards the Department of Social Administration was Ralph Miliband, the Marxist political scientist, which is kind of, and Ed Miliband's father, which is kind of interesting itself, because it was thought that social administration wasn't rigorous, it didn't have any theory and all that sort of stuff, so it wasn't like proper academic subjects like sociology or economics or something like that. So there was a lot of grief within the school, but academics are always moaning about the institutions they're in and how they won't get big enough budget and all the rest of it, so you do have to take some of it with a pinch of salt, but relationships were rather tense, I think, at certain points.
Hi, John.
Hi.
You've talked a bit about Titmuss's relations with the BMA, with doctors, with politicians and academics, and I was just wondering, could you comment a bit about public reaction to his thoughts? Is it, and does it change over time? Do they come to realize perhaps he has some valid critique, or do they not even notice, or?
I think one of the interesting things about Titmuss, I think, is that he's a public intellectual. There's no kind of two ways about this. If you read kind of a lot of standard accounts of him, he's very shy, very reticent, and all the rest of it. It didn't stop him going on radio and TV all the time. And he had, from the 1940s up until almost his death, he was constantly on the radio, for example. So he had this platform for getting his views across. And he was recognised by, in a shorthand, people on the liberal left as the authority on social administration or social policy, call it what you will. To the extent that one might argue when, the Institute of Economic Affairs starts flexing its muscles, there's no rigorous defence of the Titmuss paradigm because everybody just takes it for granted. So did his ideas get across? Yeah, to quite a large extent. I mean, in the sense that they influenced social policy academics, they also influenced the Labour Party. Somewhat implausibly, they also influenced President Nixon, who changed federal law on commercial blood banks as a result of the gift. Well, presumably there are considerations as well, but as a result of the gift relationship and the impact which it had in the States. And he was quite often cited in the States as somebody the Democrats should be listening very closely to in terms of social policy. So, yes, but it's difficult to measure that sort of thing. To go as no doubt, people in this institution are much better equipped to talk about this sort of stuff than I did. To go from having ideas to those ideas being acted out in practice is quite a big jump. So, in some places the ideas had an impact, some places they didn't. What I would say was, at least he was standing up and promoting those ideas, whether one likes them or not, is it?
Thank you. It's very, very interesting to hear your analysis of Titmuss's input into the National Health Service. But there were other things that were going on at that time, because the extraordinary thing is that social administration as a disciplinary field was so new and so undeveloped that I'd be interested to know something about what we discussed in the contribution he made to the making of the discipline of social policy and administration, and what he was contending with here, where he came in as an absolute newcomer to academia altogether.
Sure.
Would you say something?
I'll simply agree with that. I mean, I think he did, as I said at the start, almost single-handedly create the academic field, which is what I've been instructed to call it, of social policy. I think what he was also very good at, though, was gathering like-minded people around him. The obvious example being Smith and Townsend fairly early on, but later your good self and David Dodson and all the rest of it. People who shared his vision of social administration, so that it wasn't simply to be about training social workers, but rather was to have academic credibility and to have an impact on the real world and all the rest of it. So yes, I think he made a huge contribution there. I thought what you might have asked me there was whether it had any relevance today, but I wouldn't second guess your questions. But I think what's kind of interesting to me about it was it was so dominant for such a long time, and then it wasn't, kind of thing, you know. And that's one of the big kind of paradigm shifts of the last 50 years, I think. You know, there's kind of, I don't know if you read the Stephen Kleene essay about Titmuss, but he kind of says, where is Richard Titmuss now? And it's a cruel question, but quite an interesting one. You know, in terms of how we are.
Which was a cruel question.
Where is Richard Titmuss now? Why are we still interested in Richard Titmuss? It may well be he's got a lot of interesting things to tell us, but you know, from 1973 through to relatively recently, I don't think well, that's an exaggeration, but he was kind of looking out at the picture, as it were, with kind of free market economics coming to dominate and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not responding to your question, but I'm just kind of throwing up things that I think are interesting to think about in the context of Titmuss's contribution. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
Mm.
I mean, in fact,
You might not agree.
what he had to say now, then, gathering relevance, what is happening now.
Oh, no, sure. No.
And I think that will, in a sense, be something of renaissance.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because shortly after I started this project, I spoke to somebody in the Department of Social Policy who'd been doing kind of oral histories of, I don't know if Sonia actually, did she talk to you? I can't remember. But I said to him in passing over a cup of coffee, oh, of course, Richard Titmuss is now a historic figure. And she said, no, I give my students copies of the Irresponsible Society to read, and they love it. The Irresponsible Society is that it's about a rant, isn't it? There's the one that is on about schoolboys from Eton and bankers. They're all growing out of lines, blah, blah. And I'm getting a paper in Edmund, just you can check that Adrian Sinfield still teaches courses on the social division of labour, social division of welfare. So, perhaps I've been too much of a historian in thinking about it and not thought enough about it in terms of contemporary social politics.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Just on that, the mention of the social division of welfare, I think that was quite an influential piece of work that you did. Are you able to expound a little bit more on that and talk about those ideas that sort of introduced? I know it's not directly related.
No, sure. Very briefly, this was a speech Titmuss gave in 1955, I think, or 56, which later became a very famous pamphlet. It's called The Social Division of Welfare. And to put it very crudely, what he argues in that is that what we call the welfare state, again in inverted commas, is only part of a much bigger picture of welfare. So that, for example, tax breaks for the middle classes should be counted as welfare. Occupational pensions should be counted as welfare. University education should be counted as welfare. But they weren't. So it was the services for the poor, essentially what you're saying, is what constitutes people's idea of the welfare state. There's this huge kind of body of fiscal and other types of policy going on, which should be accounted for as welfare. So, I mean, it's not that long. I can remember when my wife and I first bought our house, I think you still get tax relief and mortgage payments. And why? Why is that different from social housing in real terms? Because it's a tax break to the middle class. And so the social division of welfare became, and that is one work that's still cited an awful lot as a contribution he made to our understanding of the welfare society, in broad terms, but try telling it to the Daily Mail. Good luck with that. Yeah. It's still around today.
Perhaps a slightly unfair question as well. Not in preparation for this talk, but I did give blood very recently, a couple of weeks ago, and I used the NHS have an app essentially now, which tells you for the smartphones, and it kind of you can book the appointments and everything else on there. Yeah. Do you think, because now there are lots of apps and those kind of technology is increasingly playing a part in terms of healthcare, so our understandings of our sleep patterns and our diets and everything else like this. Again, it's unfair, but how do you think that would Titmuss have perhaps seen it as a sort of a positive in its kind of collectivized potential, or would he have seen it as more atomizing of?
I don't especially like to second guess what Titmuss might have thought were he alive 50 years after his death, kind of thing. But I think, I suppose one of the things he liked about general practitioners or family doctors, as I say, was this very significant phrase that, was that you had a personal relationship with your doctor. And if you went to give blood, certainly, when I was doing it, you went to a communal area, and there was scary ladies from the women's voluntary service or whatever who told you to lie down and not get up until you'd passed 2 minutes after giving blood and all the rest of it. And it was that kind of, I mean, one shouldn't romanticize it, but it was a kind of collective experience, and what he never accounted for is one could feel good about oneself by doing that. It wasn't all altruism necessarily. But I'm not sure about that. I mean, I thought that he was, by and large, a great one for the collective, whether that would spilled over into cyberspace or whatever. I'm not entirely convinced. But I don't know.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Would Titmuss have used social solidarity as a concept?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I don't recall having.
Oh, he might not have used that expression, but I mean, when he talks about the Blitz in Dunkirk,
Yes.
that's what he's talking about, the idea that we all pulled together. And
He just actually used that terminology.
I can't remember the
That's
actual
what I
but
would be
it's what
interested
he meant. If you read the final chapter of Problems of Social Policy, which is this immense book about social services during the war, the last chapter is completely different from all the rest, because it's this very kind of lyrical thing about we must build the future and all that sort of stuff. As I say, but you've got me worried. I can't remember if he actually used the word social
I'm
solidarity.
trying to track the
Yeah.
way in which social solidarity has come into the UK parlance.
Right.
I had a feeling it was a borrowed term, but I don't know what stage it's actually borrowed.
No, I'm not sure. It's certainly what it meant, yeah, the kind of idea, as I say. The point about the Blitz in Dunkirk was that we all pulled together.
Yeah.
And that's very influential. It's been very, yeah. It's been very influential for the way we think of the Second World War, and it still is. Thanks to him, in a way.
Thanks for your talk. I was interested in what you've got on your last slide about costs. You said that he was very fond of that. It was a free service, the NHS.
Yes.
But the demand far out in 1948, they underestimate the cost.
Yeah.
And the introduction of prescription charges brought splits in Labour. I just wonder what his views about how do you reconcile spiralling costs in the NHS? If you could expand on, did he have some solutions, or what was his view longer term about where costs?
He was very conscious of the cost of drug therapies after the Second World War, and he writes several things about charging for prescriptions, for example. And on coming to them, you might superficially, as it were, expect him to be utterly against prescription charges, but he's not. He says there are certain circumstances where it's legitimate to charge for prescriptions. I think more generally what he, and this is the point about medical science, I mean, he was living through this kind of extraordinary period in medical science where, you know, antibiotics is the obvious case in point, but also surgical techniques were being revolutionised and all the rest of it. And all that had implications for costs. But his big picture answer, I think, would have been, we need to decide what kind of society we want to be. And if we want to be a society which promotes health and which reduces inequality, then we're going to have to pay for it. And that was the kind of long and the short of it. But in terms of, you know, I would find another 5 million from the budget here or there. And he wasn't all that good at that sort of stuff, I don't think. You know, but his big picture stuff was, it's a matter of choice. We have to decide what sort of society we want to be. And if we want a moral society, then we should be promoting things like the National Health Service. I mean, the other thing to say, of course, is that a lot of people, I'm not saying he was one of them, but a lot of people in the 1940s thought that when the National Health Service was introduced, there'd be an initial spike in costs, and then they'd fall continuously because people wouldn't get sick anymore. And of course, that turned out absolutely not to be the case. But another reason I suspect he was kind of hostile to the British Medical Association is because there was a kind of common trope in the 30s that doctors had a vested interest in ill health. And he never really articulates that outright, but you kind of suspect, you know, that's what he's thinking in a way. You know, it's something that knocks about the political left in the 1930s. Doctors have a vested interest in ill health. And on one level, that's, you know, if we all got rid of ill health, then we wouldn't need doctors. So what would doctors do? I mean, it's daft to think that way, but it's nonetheless, it's a kind of common idea. So in terms of things like prescriptions, he did recognise there was an issue, and of course, And Iron Bevan had recognised that early on. You know, he talked about gallons of medicines being poured down the British public's throats. And Titmuss uses somewhat similar language at points. So he is aware that there is an issue, but he's also, not to beat this question over the head, but he's also critical of some doctors, because he says that doctors will often try and curry favour with their patients by over-prescribing. And again, this is the phenomenon of, you know, you must have seen if you've been to a GP surgery, don't ask for antibiotics if you've got the cold. People go in with a cold and say, can I have some antibiotics? And some doctors give it to them. And it's still an issue today, this kind of, you know, differential prescribing. So he was very interested in the kind of, why is it doctors in Southend prescribing a different way from doctors in Sunderland or something like that.
Any more? Okay. Did you want to say anything about when the book will be?
The what, sorry?
Did you want to speak about when the book will be out? Or able to? Or
well, God willing, I plan to submit the manuscript at the end of next year. So, and the publishers assured me it'll be out shortly thereafter. So 2020. And if anybody knows anyone who wants to write a biography of Peter Townsend, he's still up for grabs as the third of the trio, is it?
Yeah.
But no, I don't.
Brilliant. Well, we'll all look forward to it. I'm sure everyone here will have an Amazon purchase order ready to go, I think. It leads me to say thank you very much to Professor John Stewart. Thank you.